Tolinski and Jaan Uhelszki, the authors of MC5, an oral biography of rock's most revolutionary band. Brad and Jan, great to have you guys on the podcast. Thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having us.
Rock's most revolutionary band. Let's start there. MC5, important to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. So in addition to recording probably rock's, certainly one of rock's 5 greatest live records of all time, Kick Out the Jams. The MC5 were really revolutionary. I mean, they were pioneers. They helped pioneer the sound of metal, the attitude of punk. And on top of that, they mixed in elements of free jazz, and then they had the showmanship of like James Brown. I mean, it was an incredible package that these guys had put together. And then on top of that, culturally important too. They were managed by one of the most important radical voices of the 60s. And they were part of an organization called the White Panthers Party. And sort of the White Panthers stood for everything that everybody is talking about now. They stood for, they were anti-racism. They were, about, freeing prisoners, about like, anti police violence, a lot of things that are being talked about in the, among the extreme left these days. These guys sort of almost originated that philosophy.
Don't forget they invented the White Panther Party. It wasn't like they were just foot soldiers. They were the pillars of it. Yeah. And it was a little, it was a little more jokey, a little more frivolous, but it was a reflection of the times. I mean, let's not forget the rock and roll, dope, and bucking in the streets part of the tenets. So it was definitely had a rock and roll edge. I was just thinking about this, like their most radical things happened after they started taking LSD. Never
As
thought
they
of
often do.
Well, it's weird because they're like this Yardbirds loving hard rock band. And then I thought, well, where did that avant jazz come from? Besides Tyner, it's like the noise and the things they heard in the noise and the Sun Ra only happened after the LSD. Like, yeah, it's in the book, but it just dawned on me today when I was listening to some of these things, getting ready for your podcast, Eric.
Well,
so punk, metal, LSD, they had it all.
They had it all. Yeah. So the book's put together. It's based around interviews with the guys in the band and not just the band. So this is all from interviews you got from Ben Edmonds.
Yeah. You want to take that, Jen?
Yeah. I mean, he basically, it was his passion project that he never finished for various reasons. I mean, one of which that he'd gotten so close to everybody in that camp that he was afraid to write it because he didn't know which way to go. Who was he going to piss off? That's how like it's like psychic violence. It's like secrets are spilled in this book, and he just couldn't write it. But he had really good interviews. And we had to get a few other interviews, like Brad talked to John Landau, the Bruce Springsteen's now manager, but then the producer of Back in the USA. So we had to supplement a little bit, but by and large, they were Ben's interviews that he'd done over a 10-year period.
While he was with CREEM and Mojo?
While he was with Mojo, because
okay.
CREEM ended Ben
began after, yeah.
Yeah, Ben left in 1975. So
okay.
He worked at Mojo from 90, I think, until he passed away.
I mean, I think it is important to note because Jan and I put a lot of work into the book. Ben had done a lot of great interviews with people, but this stuff was, not organized or put in any kind of order.
He wasn't a fan of the computer.
And it was all handwritten.
Unwritten.
And
Yeah.
we sort of had to turn it into the story that it was. And write sort of all the connecting bits to help. Because it wasn't, he had an idea that he was going to write a prose style piece, and we turned it more into a rock and roll play, if you will.
It was exactly like writing a play, like this went to this, and he said, and then she said, and it was all about balance and letting everybody have their voice. So at the end, that's what it felt like to me too, that we'd done some soap opera, really, because it's so inflammatory. There's so much blood spilled.
And people sort of have wondered why we did it as an oral biography. And a bit of that is a tribute to the members of the band and John Sinclair and all the side players. They were so articulate. They told their story so well. They were such big personalities that it sort of felt like the best thing for us to do is just organize it and get the hell out of the way. I don't know what we could have done to. I mean, it's so fun and so interesting, and these people are so wild. We just wanted to get as much of their voice on the page as we could.
Yeah, I said this before we started recording, Brad. It answered a lot of questions that I had about the MC5, because it's like, why did we just know one song, Kick Out the Jams? There's got to be more, because you hear so much about it from musicians, how influential they were. Yet it's like it kind of left out of the story when you talk about these influential bands from the 60s. And location is a big part of the story. Detroit. What was life like for the guys growing up in Detroit in the 50s and early 60s?
Well, it was like you either went to the auto industry or you went into the auto industry. We all lived in a company town.
Or you get shot in Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. So the choices were really slim and none. And those who got out tended to get out through the arts, but that was a slim number. And they just took a chance because they weren't going to do any of the other things. They were anti-war. If anything, they were anti-war and anti-draft. And they were really concerned with that, because who wanted to support a war? Who wanted to go put yourself on the front line? And that's a big part of it. Like, they talked a lot about, and I'm not sure we even put all of it in the book, but how harrowing it was to have to go to the draft board in the late 60s, and know that your number was up. But
I was sort of thinking about this question, at the root of what their story is about. And I was thinking, well, it was a bunch of working class kids who were creative and, didn't want a straight 9-to-5 job. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to go to a factory. What else do you do? And it's like the Rolling Stones song, what does a poor boy do but play in a rock and roll band? But so that's a common story in the 60s. But I think the layer that adds to all of it is sort of they took rock and roll, but then there was this whole other sort of crazy social element added to it. And somehow they became evangelists for the hippie lifestyle, for lack of a better term. And I think that's another thing that separated them. But I dare you, go listen to anybody out there. Go listen to Kick Out the Jams, the live record, and put it next to a Stones record from the very same time. And you'll really see, they make the Stones look quaint. I mean, it really is the beginning of hard rock and heavy metal. If you guys want to see where something like Black Sabbath came from before there was Black Sabbath, this was it. Nobody sounded like the MC5. Like, you listen to it now and you might think, oh, I've heard that before. But at that time, they were, they were sort of, life-changing. They blew people's minds. I mean, that's why you have musicians saying, oh my God, this band changed my life, turned around the way I thought about music.
Maybe a little too ahead of their time, to where people just couldn't wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, in many ways.
It's that thing like what happens when ideas come, when it comes too early. They were really unhinged. They were such big personalities, every single one of them. So they did things even personally, like if you would see them on the streets or see them at the Grande Ballroom where they were the house band. They were a little scary. They were like psychically scary. They were reckless. They were in your face. And, it translated in the music. What you see was really what you got all the time. And that adds to it, that whole mystery of rock and roll, like our famous people, or not even famous people, are rock stars different than the rest of us. They were like in this different category than the rest of people who even played around Detroit or even nationally, although they didn't play too much nationally.
I mean, when you think about the Stooges, we're in awe of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, that shows you sort of a little bit how extreme they were. But I think one of the things that when I was working on the book that I was, sort of shocked, and what people might find super interesting is, back in the late 60s, especially in Detroit, maybe, if you had long hair and you dressed a certain way, you became a target for the police. And these guys were arrested, beaten, thrown into jail. It makes me think, like, I don't know too many rock bands these days that would have gone through that in order just to play music. And that's what they had to do. I mean, the cops regarded them as the enemy of the state. And even though they tried to like stop them in so many of their gigs, and like I said, toss them in jail for no good reason at all, these guys just kept on going. And they believed, like, in the power of rock and roll, that the rock and roll could destroy the culture and completely rebuild it. That wasn't just sort of cute talk. They really believed that they were going to change the world.
Yeah, their lead singer Rob Tyner, he was badass. I mean, that's the only way I can put it. The dude was, he wanted to push the boundaries. But it's interesting. The band would often feel like, I don't know, they would kind of push back. He talks about being pressured at one point to be one of the guys, but he wasn't going to do that. Just to your point, Brad, like, this is who I am, take it or leave it. And he talks about being pressured to fit in. Now they actually thought about getting rid of him. What would
many times they
I mean, how would we be talking about the MC5 today if that happened?
We wouldn't, because he was an integral piece. He was like the brains. He was the lyricist. He was the unhinged front man. And honestly, they thought about getting rid of him simply because they didn't think he was good looking enough, or he was too fat, And he wasn't. You look at the pictures of the film of Tarter Field when they played in at Wayne State University in Detroit in 1970. It's like I kept thinking, what, too fat? It was really that superficial at times. I mean, they hired a bass player because he was like a babe bang magnet, Michael Davis. So there was like a frivolous, like, commercial side of them as well. I mean, the famous quote is that John Sinclair says is they wanted to be bigger than the Beatles, and I wanted to be bigger than Chairman Mao. So you've got that going too. There's two strands, because there are this and that. It's like high and low culture.
Yeah, I think they would have probably ended up being like a well-regarded garage rock band from the era without Rob. But Rob is the one that his personality was so wild. It was Rob that allowed them to perform in the same arena as Jimi Hendrix, or allowed him to perform in the same arena as Janis Joplin, and compete with those wild and extreme characters. But you know what? I mean, it's easy to see from hindsight. If you were part of the band, you were like, I don't know, is this guy too weird? Is he pushing the boundaries too much? Like, we want to be the Rolling Stones. Like, this guy, he's just too much of a weirdo. But the truth is they wouldn't have crawled out of Detroit unless it was for that sort of avant-garde experimental thing that Rob brought to the band.
I think he's the linchpin of the book anyway, because when Ben Edmonds was doing his interviews, he went and moved in with Rob and his wife, and enough time had passed, and not apparently enough bitterness, and he decided to just break that code, the MC5 code of silence, and decided to tell everything. And that was where the book started, was the 3 months that Ben Edmonds lived with the Tyners. And then he had that as a base code, so he could go to everybody else and ask them the same events or tell them what Rob had said. So I think that he had a real strategy, a real Machiavellian strategy, if you will, to get everybody talking and to actually loosen their lips and not be precious, like tell the truth of this. And I think, to me, that's why this book, to me, I mean, I read it like a reader and I go, wow, I can't believe they said that. When we were working on it, there were times I would pace around the room because I couldn't believe some of the things that the secrets that they would say about each other, the shit talking they would do, or, you know, or the fights, the fist fights that they would get in. It was like, you know, Oasis, but not real brothers.
The musical influences are so many. So we haven't mentioned Wayne Kramer and Fred Smith, Fred Sonic Smith, and they're important to the sound. And it's this eclectic range of musical influences. You talk about the bands and the artists that they were influenced by and how they would synthesize them to create the unique sound of the MC5.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, early on, it was the Stones, the Who, and the Yardbirds.
Yeah.
Those were really, you know, it's sort of funny how they talk about the Beatles, you know, as being sort of corny, you know. They didn't want to be that. They didn't want to be clean cut. They wanted to be on the edge and they wanted to be dangerous. But then really, Rob Tyner, again, we're back to him, and their manager, John Sinclair, were serious jazz guys. And they brought into the band this whole idea of, you know, you can play something, you can, you know, play your rock stuff, but let's make it a little bit more wild. Let's make it a little bit more strange. Like, don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to be yourself. I think, you know, I've played in a lot of rock bands, and I think especially rock bands growing, you know, when they're first starting out, they're always thinking like, oh, you know, I want to be Led Zeppelin, or I want to be the Stones, or I want to be Oasis, or whatever it is that they want to be. And it takes them a minute to figure out, well, I'm really not going to get anywhere by imitating these guys. We have to find out what's unique to us. And so the band just started stirring in all of these other things, you know, which is everything from John Coltrane. And to get themselves worked up before their shows, they would always listen to James Brown. I mean, there was this whole Detroit R&B, black music performance element to what they did too, that, you know, separated them from the other guys. You know, there's so little film of them, but what's out there, you can kind of see them just taking a hold of the stage and, you know, going to town and dancing and jumping and moving. They had this philosophy that you were going to entertain. They were going to entertain. They were going to make every minute on that stage count. And sometimes it was at the cost of the music. They could be pretty grungy. I mean, they were sort of punk rock in that way, you know.
Yeah.
But they definitely wanted they definitely took that sort of entertainment element from Black Detroit and put it into their rock and roll act.
Well, look at even like Grambling Rose that you were talking about before. It's like when Wayne had that particular step that he did to kind of these little mincing steps where he scoot across the stage. I mean, there was always this sense of humor underneath it as well. You know, that they like a wink, wink, like, you know, this is funny. I mean, especially when they did their choreography. I mean, it wasn't like Kiss doing their back and forth thing, but it was a little bit close to Kiss doing their little back and forth choreography. So, you know, you would have them doing like Albert Eiler and Sun Ra and having a song like Black to Come, but you'd have this other part. And that's what I always loved about them is that like high and that low, that element. And, you know, you really didn't know where they were coming from. But Brad's right, it was the entertainment. The people who came to see him worked at factories, and Wayne Kramer would always say, we have to work as hard as they do. You know, they expect a show.
John Coltrane, you mentioned that, and this is in the book, Rob Tyner's first name, Rob Derminer, I think it's pronounced, and he Derminer. So he says, I had a real passion for John Coltrane's pianist McCoy Tyner, so I became Rob Tyner. And he also came up with the name MC5 too, which he thought was cool. It was like Einstein's E equals MC squared. He thought it sounded cool. Yeah, The Men was the other much better choice. MC5, yeah.
Much better.
That's awesome. Some great stories in the book about those early days too. Wayne Kramer talks about discovering feedback and clearing out rooms but they brought in new fans as well. But that didn't include their early drummer. There's the story. Do you remember the story of Bob Gaspar Gaspar, where he's in the band, but he's like, it's too loud.
Yeah, he freaks out. It's like, doesn't he just stop drumming that day? He just
right.
like, yeah, it's like he's had it.
Yeah. How many in here think this music's too loud? And everybody's like, fuck you. It's perfect.
Yeah. Well, that was a problem in the early days. They had to weed out the good kids.
Right.
Good kids go home now.
Yeah. Wayne Kramer said he went back to the drums with his tail between his legs after he said that. That's when he probably knew his days in the MC5 are numbered. See ya.
Well, that was the other thing. It was sort of fun in this part of the book too, because it not only explores their career, but it also talks about the whole music industry and the music world in the early and late 60s. And, you know, in Detroit, there was such a history because of Motown and because of the black music history of things being very slick, you know, people singing, you know, incredibly well, you know, from Smokey Robinson to, you know, David Ruffin, the Temptations. And they were like, there's no way we can compete with that. So we're just going to come on like the toughest, like, you know, baddest biker gang you can imagine and just scare the shit out of people. You know, we're not even going to try to compete with that. And they would dress in black and leather and have the biggest amps and all that stuff. And it was really interesting in the book to hear those guys talk about those early days and how they ended up, you know, finding the virtues of power chords and the biggest amps and the loudest guitars, you know, that we've all since, that many bands have since stolen from, you know.
Yeah.
But I like the charming part where they were opened up for the Dave Clark 5, and there's not in our book, there's a photo somewhere of them standing in front of Dave Clark 5, and they're dressed exactly the same, because prior to the black leather, they were wearing little dark green corduroy vests and beetle boots and stovepipe pants too. So they did not become dangerous overnight. You know, it was a long journey out. But I love that too. I love the whole transition of them.
We mentioned John Sinclair, so let's get to him now, where he enters the story, which is 1966. The band has all the pieces in place, but they're at this point where it's either they go big or they throw in the towel. So they bring in Sinclair. Talk about who John Sinclair is, his importance in the Detroit hipster scene, and then how they end up bringing him in as their manager.
John was basically, you know, an intellectual, a poet, a huge fan of jazz and free jazz music. And what made him different was, instead of just loving this stuff, he had the soul of an organizer. Like, he wasn't just content for him to love it. He wanted to share this, and knew in order for it to be something that he could share, he would, you know, open up, places, cafes, whatever, for these bands to play, book them, organize like-minded people, collect money. He had all of this sort of thing where he wasn't content just to be a hipster. He wanted to be able to spread the word. And that means, organizing, putting on concerts. And he wrote for like 4 or 5 different magazines. He was always spreading the word of his free jazz and his radical politics. And at first, the band sort of approached him. They wanted him to help them, to manage them. And in the beginning, he wasn't so sure about it. It took him.
Well, they played. He got out of jail, and they had a big party at this place called the Artist Workshop, where it was kind of like hippie central, and so many people wanted to welcome him back to Detroit after he'd been incarcerated, that they were going to play at 2 or 3 in the morning. And John wasn't all that keen, or his wife, Lenny Sinclair, wasn't, because he just come out of jail and they didn't want to have any noise ordinance and attract the police. So that was their scheme, to come to his attention. And he wasn't sure that he was having it. Like, I think it was just a series of events that he succumbed to their charms. Because then Rob Tyner wrote a letter to the Fifth Estate, the underground newspaper, and it was smart, and it was erudite, and it was very jazz-centric. And I think that kind of primed the pump for everything else that came after.
It excited John. And he helped open up this great concert venue called the Grandy Ballroom, which is the whole story of that is in the book as well, and started helping to book that place. And it just started steamrolling from there. And then I think it was John had met the manager of the Grateful Dead, who was also sort of this freaky guy. And the manager of the Grateful Dead said, well, why aren't you managing these guys? You can do it. And Sinclair was like, well, I guess if he can do it, I can do it. But then I think that John started seeing how he could, and I don't mean this in a negative way, how he could use the band to help him further his message. Yeah. I always say John Sinclair used the MC5 to weaponize his politics. Like, he knew that he wanted to reach these kids, and it was easier to reach them using rock and roll than it was by writing a poem or writing something in in an underground magazine.
And wasn't Black to Calm the song that he loved? That was the one that
I love that too. Yeah.
You first noticed?
Yeah. Because it was the closest to like heavy metal free jazz. It was close to what John loved. I mean, John loved the craziest, most discordant music you could imagine. The weirder, the better for him. So that was the other part that sort of turned him on about the MC5, is that the 5 could go from playing, Louie Louie to playing, Sun Ra, in the style of these free jazz guys. And he was just like, okay, you've got me hooked.
Yeah. Black to Calm was about like the PA setup, right? I thought, oh, this must be like about racial divide or something.
No, it's where the wire goes, so you would remember. I love the pragmatism of that. I mean, I love that song way, though.
Brad Tolinski and Jaan Uhelszki, the authors of MC5, an oral biography of rock's most revolutionary band. I'm going to get to a concert in Chicago, August of '68, which helped gain the band national attention. And you talk about how Norman Mailer lionized MC5 as true counterculture heroes. And this concert also led to a major label record deal with Elektra. Talk about that Festival of Life concert, because Wayne Kramer had a great story about the hash cookies that only take one, and they had like two or three.
I think that the thing was is so many bands were supposed to come, like the Jefferson Airplane, and I think Country Joe and the Fish, and the Up, who was part of the MC5 family. But bigger bands were supposed to come as well. Abby Hoffman was one of the organizers, and that day it was a festival that was outside of the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, and people thought that there could be trouble, riots, but they were going to be the Festival of Light, and they were going to like mitigate some of that whole hippie kind of spirit. And when they got there, there was no setup, there was nothing. They had to plug their amps into a hot dog stand, like a little trolley hot dog stand, and they were at level with the crowd, and they got about 3/4 through their set, and rocks were being thrown, and cops with billy sticks were coming out after the crowd. So they stopped playing and hightailed it out of there and got out. But they were the only band gutsy enough to do it, stupid enough to do it. And Norman Mailer had that great quote about had the horns of Huns ever had noise to compare. It was just a terrific, tremendous MC5 noise. I mean, you can see little clips of that on YouTube, and it's so unprofessional. It's like this big media event was just a really small little like them standing on blankets pretty much. Yeah. But it was the concert that was heard around the world because it really got them a place in history.
Yeah, so they were at the Democratic National Convention, and you have the world's political press there. Everybody in the U.S. in the news, and here they were playing in this park and completely disrupted it. But what's funny is that wasn't really their intention. I mean, Sinclair said, well, we just wanted to show people an alternative way to live life, and just show them, how kids can have fun, like listening to the music and doing their own thing. But like almost everything else that the MC5 did, it just ended up escalating into total chaos. Soon the police are there with clubs, there's tear gas, zillions of people running in thousands of different directions, all just because these guys wanted to play some rock and roll in the park.
But we're forgetting the really important part. I mean, it's not like they're innocent trouble magnets. I mean, kick out the jams, motherfucker. It's those 5 words have created this domino effect that touched every single part of them from beginning to end. That was their little cackle that they would say to other bands, and that became an organizing, anthemic kind of rallying cry. I mean, so much that people think about that before they think about the band, but because they refused to back down on that, they would get arrested. A lot of the arrests happened because it was a censorship problem. They would not say motherfucker.
Yeah. That was actually something that would be part of their downfall, just that simple phrase of kick out the jams, motherfucker. But it's like to this day, like even when I tell somebody, it's like, you got to listen to MC5, and then I immediately think of kick out the jams, motherfucker. And every, like, if somebody's a rock and roll fan, they're like, oh yeah, man, they know exactly what I'm talking about. So they have their place in rock history, and that's not a bad thing to be known for that. I think that's cool. The trivia in the book is great. How they submitted a demo to the Beatles when they started the record label Apple, but they didn't get signed to them. They got signed to Elektra, but Rob Tyner was happy knowing that, hey, Elektra's cool, man. Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and the Doors and all that. But yeah, the Beatles label was like, they were James Taylor, right? That was, they weren't looking for a band like the MC5, but Rob Tyner was like, hey man, that's cool. We'd rather be with Elektra.
Well, the interesting thing is, though, and we tell the story in the book, and for all the Beatles fans out there, is that, they tried to get on Apple Records. The Beatles A&R, or whoever was in charge of it, thought they were too wild and too harsh to put on their label. But interestingly enough, John Sinclair later gets tossed into jail for smoking 2 joints. And John Lennon ended up coming to the rescue in many ways. And, we tell the story in the book. John didn't play, he only played a handful of shows after the Beatles broke up. And one of them was a benefit concert to get John Sinclair out of jail. That was a huge deal. Like, you don't want to minimize what the MC5 and what John Sinclair meant at the time. Maybe it's been lost a little bit, but to have John Lennon, come to Ann Arbor, Michigan to play a show for you to help you get out of jail. Dude, you're pretty big.
And
you're a pretty important force.
Wrote a song for him too.
Yes, that I was going to say that's the first time I ever really found out about John Sinclair is the Lennon song, which I think it's on John Lennon's box set. So I think that's where I first heard it. And then Blind Melon covered the
Sometime in New York, and it's the best song on the record too.
Yeah.
So Elektra would release the debut Kick Out the Jams album, the live album at the Grandee Ballroom in downtown Detroit, October of '68. You call it one of the most important recordings of the era. Can you expand on that? The album's importance.
Well, I guess, we touched on this before. I mean, it starts out with them yelling, "Kick out the jams, motherfucker." Now, you can put on any record these days, and you'll hear the word motherfucker like, every other word sometimes, especially like in the hip hop world and stuff. Yeah. But that made people lose their minds. I mean, you're starting out your first record with that phrase. It's definitely going to get under some people's skin, and that's definitely what it was. But the record itself is just so uninhibited. Like, when you talk about, we talked about the free jazz influence on their playing. It's not like they're playing like John Coltrane, like with a zillion different notes and different modes, and but they are playing with that sort of complete uninhibited sort of freedom. And I don't know, like I said, like the Stones or the Who at that time were considered maybe the most radical bands. But if you put one of their records next to Kick Out the Jams, Kick Out the Jams, just in terms of sheer raw energy, completely blows all of that out of the water.
How many bands lead with a live album too?
Well, I know.
Debut albums live.
That's where they shown. I mean, they were a live band. Like, it made sense for the label because it's cheaper. And to the band, they actually wanted to do that because, hey, they'd never been in a studio except for doing 2 singles, for a little local label. And they were secure in how they could deliver a live show. And they also thought that they were going to get to choose from 3 or 4 shows, maybe 2 or 3 shows, but they didn't. That was like in stone. Like, they only recorded those 2 nights, and one night was, worse than the other night. I mean, it was not I was there. It was not a perfect performance. It's like one of those where you're going, "Oh no, please."
You were there, you said?
I worked in the ballroom.
Yeah.
So it was, it was one of those things. Although, ultimately it worked out because it's a document of a time. What I think it is for me is being like a young teenager then. It was like it establishing us and them. Like, you were fine with Kick Out the Jams, motherfuckers. You were on that side. You were a bad kid, It's like what Brad said before, the good kids go. And it was like your parents were going to hate it. Everybody hated it. The record company had, were squirrely about it. Record stores were busted if they carried it. You know,
Right.
it
Yeah.
really like throwing the gauntlet down in terms of this whole youth quake that was actually happening. It's a little past the youth quake because that was more 1966, 67, riot in the streets time, but it really is Midwestern teenagers go nuts, like Wild Child. And it really starts that off. It starts off the Detroit version of a hippie movement. And again, another famous Wayne quote is the summer of love never made it to Detroit. Because really, Detroit teenagers weren't hippie kids, you know? It's like the MC5 like guns, you know? People like guns in Detroit. People were violent. It's abusive there, you know? You are not filled with the milk of human kindness. It's a rough city. And they were really emblematic of that kind of Detroit energy. I mean, I'm really proud of them. I'm proud of being from Detroit anyway. Brad too. You know, I don't know if he's as proud as I am, but I'm always I identify with it really hugely. And to me, they are like my spirit man.
Are you both from Detroit?
We are.
Okay. So you're happy the Detroit Lions are playing really good these days, finally. I'm a Steelers fan. I'm sorry. Gotta
keeping my fingers crossed. You know, the thing about the Lions, they wouldn't be the Lions if they didn't always just keep you on the edge of your seat. I mean, you're just waiting for them. You don't feel confident with the Detroit Lions.
Well, I'm just gonna say I've been a Red Sox fan for many, many, many years. So the longest time we just figured it's never going to happen. Bill Buckner, the whole thing, and here we are now with Red Sox have I don't know 3-4 World Series. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen. I root for the Lions all the time. I love it. So by late 68, MC5's Contra Draw, they're on a major record label. They made the cover of Rolling Stone. I mean, that's wild before their debut album's even released. But then 3 years later, they disband. So, this all kind of starts, I guess, the first of many self-hammered nails in the coffin starts with a show at the Fillmore East, December 26, 1968. What happens on that night?
Motherfuckers.
Yeah.
Again.
Just one word.
One word this time. They were like another hippie tribe, like radicals, and they had made common cause with Sinclair and the White Panthers, and they wanted tickets into the show. They had already pissed off Bill Graham, who was the proprietor owner of the Fillmore, and he wouldn't give them the tickets, so they got chains and created like a riot after the show, right after the show. And
so there was this other group of radicals that were even one-upping the MC5, and they were literally called the Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers. That was their names. And they basically were anarchists, and they just wanted to create trouble for the establishment, for the authority, for whatever. And of all people to come and disrupt the MC5, who have been promoters of the cause, right? And they go to play the show, and the Up Against the Wall motherfuckers decide that they're going to make a hash out of it, that they're going to create trouble. And one of the biggest promoters at the time was this guy named Bill Graham, who's from San Francisco. And he also ran the Fillmore East in New York. And he was there for the show. Biggest promoter in the entire United States. And at one point, the motherfuckers take a chain and hit him in the head and almost blind him. So even though it wasn't the MC5's fault, Bill Graham hated their guts from that time afterwards, which basically made it difficult for them to play a lot of venues in the United States. It just created
he had a huge influence. Yeah.
And so you have this huge problem broiling. You've got the establishment mad at them and taking their records out of the store because they use the word motherfucker. You have Bill Graham, who's a concert promoter, saying like, I don't want to work with these guys, they suck. Then you have Rolling Stone that puts them on the cover, and then a couple of issues later writes a terrible review of their first record. And pretty soon the band starts going into this sort of downward spiral that's also exacerbated by the fact that John Sinclair, their manager, gets busted for smoking 2 joints and gets thrown in jail. So, I mean, that's the interesting thing about this, the MC5 story. You're reading this thing, you're seeing this trajectory, you're seeing this attention at first. It looks like they're going to be a massive band. And then all of a sudden, everything crashes in on them. And they never really, they do 2 more records, but they never really quite recover from all of that stuff.
Yeah, this is the quote from the book. If their climb to the top had been long and hazardous, their downhill slide was shockingly rapid and twice as painful. Yeah. And is it true the radio stations were dropping the song from their playlist, but also record store clerks were being threatened with jail time for selling the album because
it was obscene.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was breaking the obscenity laws.
I mean, yeah, really, like talk about just a quick downhill fall. It's Elektra dropped the bands, but Atlantic signs them, which is, it's like, okay, Atlantic back on track here. But at this point,
like within, actually, like the timeline is ridiculously fast. They got dropped while their record was, rocketing up charts at number 30, and 3 weeks later, Atlantic signed them. So that part it gets a little misinterpreted. But the thing is then they have, they're already making plans to record the follow-up to that record, which also came pretty quickly too.
Which is back in the USA?
USA. Yep.
And then High Time.
Then High Time, the last one.
Both on Atlantic. Yeah. And John Sinclair brought in John Landau to produce the first one, but they both barely reached the top 200.
Yeah, and the crazy part was they thought of that as the antidote to the Lester Bangs review, thinking, oh, we'll have one of their own work with the MC5, and it will mitigate this bad review that Lester Bangs wrote.
Didn't Lester Bangs express regret about that? Or I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it's in the book. Yeah.
He's one of Rob Tyner's best friends in the end. They died very close together.
Yeah, so for listeners that might not know this story very well, Lester Bangs was probably the most influential rock writer of that era. People really listened and responded to what he had to say. And he was a great writer, and he was hilarious and all these things. And he wrote a negative review of the band, and it really, really hurt the band, like with their cred, with all the kids. And so to sort of combat that bad record review, they got probably the other guy that was the most important record reviewer, this guy named John Landau, who also worked for Rolling Stone. And they said, well, okay, this record review guy says he sucks. Well, we're going to get this other great record review guy to say that they're great and produce their records, And John Landau actually went on to produce Bruce Springsteen and Born to Run, and
he's with the famous quote, I seen the future of rock and roll, and it's Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah, and so but Landau's record that he produces for the MC5, which was the first record that he ever produced, was something of a disappointment. It became really influential later, but at the time, he had sort of tightened up the band's sound, and a lot of people saw that as the band selling out.
And
now a lot of people see that same record as being like the beginning of punk rock.
I, being one of the Detroit bands at the time, felt like the rest of the Detroit bands really betrayed by that. I mean, it opened with a cover, it ended with a cover, you know. That just broke my heart for you know, for a long time. I thought that they'd lost it. And, you know, there's that other little fillip about, you know, then John Sinclair goes to jail, and they you know, there's two sides of that story, but a lot of Michigan local bands thought that they'd abandoned him. So that was another one of the fast slide down, twice as painful parts of the story.
Have you ever seen any story like this with any other band? Like,
never.
You know, it's.
Well, I say about the book and about the story about the MC5 and why this story need to be told is, you know, I edited Guitar World for 25 years and heard a lot of great rock and roll stories, you know, and Jaan has been writing for that long and interviewing people and worked at CREEM Magazine. I think this is the greatest rock and roll story never told. I mean, you know, it's so crazy and so exciting and happens in such a condensed time period. And they ascend so quickly and fall apart so quickly. And I don't know, it's just a crazy, chaotic, disastrous, interesting story.
Has there been a proper documentary on them done?
There has been, but it was in litigation. Wayne Kramer had sued the filmmakers because he had this is what I remember of the case. I don't have the court documents because he wasn't paid as the musical director, so it lives in limbo. And there's a man who's trying to resurrect it, who's raised funds to try to get it released. It's really good. I mean, it's really good.
Were you asked to be part of it, both of you?
I was asked to be part of it with Dave Marsh, who was also at CREEM with me, and we weren't actually. They filmed us, and later they sent, well, there was a train going by, so we didn't get your dialogue. But
but
you know, I've always felt like they were my band.
Yeah.
Because it was like they worked where I worked. Yeah. I saw Rick at the Grandy, but you know what really always strikes me, and more so when Brad and I were working on this, where we talked about it was like writing a play. It's like there are times, there's pivotal points, and you want to go, stop, don't do that. How about this? Like you keep wanting to rewrite the ending because there's something so endearing's not the right word, but you sympathize with them. It's like Becky Tyner, Rob Tyner's wife, has a quote talking about their fatal flaw, like an Aristotle, you know, or Shakespearean tragedy. Like there's a flaw that creates everything that comes after, and that their success was never assured because of that. She calls it the sin of pride, but there's a little too much truth in that too.
But you know, they're also a perfect Detroit story because Detroit. It's like all about the underdog.
Like the Lions, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You
know, the underdog, yeah.
Like it never quite comes together, but you know, it's like the Bad News Bears.
Yeah.
I know.
Hey, 84 Tigers. I remember I was 12. I remember that.
Wait, 68 Tigers.
I saw Denny McClain.
Yeah.
I saw Denny McClain win one of his 30 games.
Yeah. Oh.
I have an picture of him.
But you're going back to 1969. It's like a drought, you know.
Well, I'll say this just to put it out there, the songs that people really should hear, and I'm going to put them. They're all in the playlist for this episode. I think you can find it in the show notes. But yeah, of course, kick out the jams. I mean, thankfully they have that song that a lot of people are familiar with. But Human Being Lawnmower,
yeah,
Teenage Lust, Call Me Animal, Looking at You.
I love that.
The American Ruse.
Yeah.
Let Me Try. So that's the mellow side of MC5 too, like the range, right?
Yeah. Sister Ann, don't forget Sister Ann.
Yes.
That's great.
So was Atlantic part of this too? Like, did they just have a lack of interest? Because I think Wayne Kramer said that he was disappointed that they didn't get behind it either.
That what? I'm sorry.
Atlantic, that they didn't get behind those albums and help promote.
They didn't. There's quotes. I think it's a Danny Gills quote where he talks about. I mean, it was the bottom line, or maybe it was John Landau, but they just weren't selling records. It's the part where their manager fires them. They're I forgot his name. It's terrible of me. The big New York manager, D. Anthony.
Oh yeah.
But won't take their calls, fires them, and then sues them for unpaid, percentages. So Atlantic was right there. They were pretty much hand in glove.
Well, it's a weird time in the music industry, right? Because there's a transition. This might go over some of your younger readers' heads, but there was this period in the 60s where you had AM radio that was all about the hit singles. Like if you didn't have the hit single, your record wasn't going to sell. I mean, part of the success of the Doors was because they had great singles, or bands like Cream from those days, they had great singles. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, you get to this idea of the album, of the artistic statement. And in a weird way, the MC5 were caught like a little bit in the middle of that. And the problem with back in the USA was there was no hit single. You were just into the energy of the band. Like it was a cool record, but there was no hit single. And if there was no hit single, then the album wasn't going to sell. FM radio hadn't really, really kicked in yet, and I think even what was there for FM radio, they didn't like the second record. They thought it was too tame. So it was this weird thing. The radical underground thought the second record was, they had tamed too much, but it wasn't tame enough for the kids, for the hit singles, that kind of thing. So they were just caught really in between. I think, personally, it's their third record where they really figured it out. And to me, that's the great mystery, because the third record, High Time, feels like it should have been a classic 70s album-oriented rock record. Sister Anne is a great song. Baby Won't Ya is a great riff. I mean, I put that right up there with any Led Zeppelin riff. I love the riff in Baby Won't You. It's just like great. Try to think of this other song that I love.
Miss X, Gotta Keep Moving, Future Now.
Gotta Keep Moving.
Okay.
Yeah. Not which is as good of a Stones song as any Stones song.
Written by their drummer, Dennis Thompson.
Yeah, that record should have been big, but by that time the label had already lost interest. They just didn't believe it. It didn't get a push, and then shortly after that, the band just fell apart.
It always breaks my heart is on High Time. They have a picture of the busted clock, like a band that ran out of time. Like that to me, that was like, it's over, babe. Like it. Like that was a bad symbol.
Yeah,
I'm looking at it right here. Yeah, and Dennis Thompson is quoted in the book as saying that the pressures the band was under led to the use of heroin, which was another factor in the band's downfall. Bassist Michael Davis left, drummer Dennis Thompson was next, and then the group disbanded not long after a show at the Grandee Ballroom on New Year's Eve 1972, which did not go well. That's where Wayne Kramer walked off the stage, and Rob Tyner is quoted in the book. He says, quote, "Our last album, High Time, was all about the band taking control. Had we stayed together, it would have been a good beginning." And then Rob's wife said, quote, "If someone had just taken the MC5 by the hand and said, all right, this is what's going to happen, they would have been more successful." Now, Wayne Kramer said it was 3 reasons. He has Elektra rushing the first album out as one, losing John Sinclair as manager, and not getting John Landau to manage the band as the other 2 reasons. What do you think? If you could hit the restart button and see it done differently, could the story of MC5 have been different?
It's those things, those moments, like what would you stopped, the one thing about Detroiters is you can never tell them what to do.
Really? Okay. I'm learning something about Detroit.
Make me, like you tell a Detroiter something, they'll go make me, or they'll think make me. And the thing is no one would have ever told them anything. It was a confluence of events, you know. It's like, had they not taken out an ad that said, here we go again, the F word, Bug Hudson's, because that was the name of the retailer who wouldn't pull the record off the shelves because of the obscenity, and they put in Elektra's logo into that. So that was what led to them being dropped. And it was like, there were so many little events like that. There's nothing you could have fixed. It was like they were on a fast train to oblivion, you know. It was like someone had set their course, and I don't know why, you know.
Well, to me, like the story now almost says it all about MC5. Like, I don't think, you know, you could imagine maybe something different happening, but it didn't, and it couldn't. And you even look at, okay, so the band finally, after getting rejected 6 or 7 times into the Hall of Fame, finally gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Everybody's cheering, but they all like in the past.
Okay, just say it, Brad.
You know, Wayne Kramer dies.
Yeah,
right?
he was.
Dennis Thompson dies. John Sinclair dies. They're
and
all dead before they even get inducted into the Hall of Fame. It only seems fitting for this band.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wayne Kramer was probably the most well-known, at least for me, because I always saw his name in guitar magazines and all. He was out there for a while, and he was carrying the band's name there for a while there too. But what if they just had no involvement with politics? Like, how would that? Because that was Rob Tyner was warned by Janis Joplin and Country Joe McDonald, like, just don't do that stuff, man. I'm telling you, it's you know, they're going to use you up and throw you away like tissue paper, right? That's the quote. So what would that have changed? Or that's just one of the many
politics that helped make them famous.
I think so too. I
okay.
think
it was saying the word motherfucker that helped make them famous. You know, like all of the things that helped them grab national attentions were the things that destroyed them. It's the irony.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, the irony of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you break down what became the band members and John Sinclair after the MC5 broke up. Rob Tyner, he passed in 91. Guitarist Fred Smith died in 94. Both died of a heart attack. And then there were reformed lineups. Wayne Kramer formed a band in 2022 under the name We Are All MC5. Sadly, we lost Kramer early 2024. Dennis Thompson passed in May 8th of this year. So all of the original members are gone. So my last question is, how should MC5 be remembered?
It's the world's most revolutionary band.
Says it right there.
Yeah.
MC5, an oral biography of rock's most revolutionary band. It is out October 7?
8.
8. So it's out October.
You can go out and get it now.
You can pre-order the book now.
Pre-order it.
Yeah, so you can get that wherever books are sold, Amazon. So where can people find you guys online if they want to reach out to you? Websites, anything you want to get out there, social media?
I have a Facebook page. I think
I have a Facebook page.
Jan does. I mean, you can reach out to us through there.
You can get me at creemmagazinejaan at creem.com.
Okay.
And 2 A's.
But the book, you can, you know, it's available online. You just type in the title, and a bunch of different ways that you can buy it will come up. We are going to be doing some, you know, signings and some events. We're doing 3 events in Detroit on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. And then we're going to be in Los Angeles when, Jan, do you remember?
October 24th.
October 24th.
At Music Head Gallery on Sunset.
Okay.
And I'm actually going to be at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on the day that they're inducted, signing books in the Hall of Fame itself.
Oh, cool.
On the 19th.
Yeah, cool. All right. So are those dates anywhere online that people can go to? Because I'd love to put the link up if they're being promoted, I'm sure somewhere.
Oh yeah, I'll share those with you.
Send them over. Thank you so much, guys. This was great. Congrats on the book. It's a fascinating book, and I'm now officially an MC5 fan. I'm going to be listening to the music from here on out.
Pick out the jams, motherfucker.
There you go.
I thought you were going to say you were a Lions fan now.
I'm still gonna. I can't. My Steelers, man. I'm faithful to my Steelers.
We could talk about the Lions offline for
All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.